Hi, my name is Laura Jordan. I'm a National Board Certified Teacher out of Boulder, Colorado, and this professional learning session is going to be focused on using recorded instruction to help develop, deepen, and repair the relationships that we create with kids. This session would be geared towards secondary language arts teachers, secondary literacy teachers, and possibly culturally and linguistically diverse educators as well. So if I was in a live session, I would stop here and brainstorm with folks and ask them how they create space to develop the relationships that we all know are so important for kids. And once I'd listened and understood how other folks are making it happen, I would offer this for their consideration, that one way to create space for relationship building is to use recorded instruction during classes. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. So what is recorded instruction? Recorded instruction is simply using a podcast or a screencast or a YouTube video or some other form of digital information sharing in your classroom as part of your instructional cycle. I would recommend this once every week or two or however often you need, because what it does is it frees up the teacher to conduct student conferences on a variety of topics. And those topics could involve social and emotional considerations along with the content and skills that we're also trying to develop for our students. Now, a really important question that we want to answer today is, why is it important? Why is it important to develop relationships with kids, and why is it important to provide content during that relationship building that's going to be deep and important? And the answer to that is this, that in order to be culturally responsive teachers, we really have to be aware of several aspects of student growth. We need to understand students' cultural hardwiring, along with the brain research on how the brain learns and what impedes the brain from learning. And then we want to talk about how we address classroom climate and how we ensure that instruction that we provide in the classroom creates active learners who are going to build what Zaretta Hammond calls intellective capacity, and that is a student's malleable information processing power. Also, it can be referred to as fluid intelligence or intellectual competence, but essentially it's that understanding that learners are critical thinkers and they are independent thinkers. So all the work we do is toward that end. So let's start with students' cultural hardwiring. It's important to understand that 80% of the world's population is collectivist in nature, so that even though in the US the dominant culture is individualistic, other communities inside of the US lean toward collectivism. And what is a constant among collectivist communities, although they can differ dramatically in many aspects, is a focus on relationships and cooperative learning. And what I want us to sort of carry throughout this session is the idea that relationships are hardwired. Kids learn best when they are in positive relationships with others. That includes the teacher and the students. Also when they are cooperative in their approach to learning. So throughout this session, we're going to be looking at relationships and cooperative learning. All right, the next thing that's important to bring into our understanding is that the brain's main goals are safety and well-being. So it wants to keep us safe and it wants us to be happy. So any anxiety presents in our bodies a threat to that safety, and our body's response is to release cortisol. Now that unfortunately reduces working memory, and that in turn reduces our intellective capacity. So when students feel anxious, uncomfortable, unwelcomed, othered in a classroom, this cortisol release actually inhibits their learning. And the second thing we want to consider with regard to the brain science is that social bonding, or our body's feeling of well-being, releases oxytocin, and that regulates heartbeat and creates clarity of thinking, which actually increases intellective capacity. So for anyone thinking, well, why does it really matter that I make my kids feel safe and welcomed and affirmed in my classroom? It's because of oxytocin and how that impresses the brain and helps it to further its own intellectual pursuits. Armed with that brain research, we now understand more deeply the idea that culturally responsive teaching requires that teachers build positive relationships with students that students feel or experience as caring, and that starts with building trust. One way to do that is to set aside time to conference with students. But anybody who's working in a classroom can tell you that time is at a premium, right? And so it's so difficult to find that time that what I want to help you understand today is that creating digital opportunities for instruction is one of those ways. So in that spirit, we want to make sure that that digital presentation is not just filling space, but it is actually creating active learners who build their intellective capacity. So while you are building, deepening, and then sometimes repairing relationships, you want to ensure that the work that's going on for the rest of the students in the classroom is advancing and that it is full of integrity. So your goal is to create active learners who are going to build their intellective capacity. Okay, so perhaps you're thinking, oh my gosh, that sounds phenomenal. How do I do that? Well, there are two things that you want to think through when you're planning how to work all of this into a class session. The first thing is, what is it you are going to present digitally? Bearing in mind that it has to grow students' content understandings, it has to position students to practice the art of active learning, and it's going to help them to understand the moves that successful students make in their own education so that they can mimic and then begin to own those moves. That is the hallmark of culturally responsive teaching. And the second thing that you want to work through is, what am I going to discuss in those one-on-one conferences? So it's got to reduce student anxiety while concurrently building trust and community, because we know that cortisol is a detractor of education and oxytocin is an additive. So we want to maximize oxytocin, and that is done through reducing student anxiety and building their trust. And then your conferences can also combine their social and emotional considerations with the intellective capacity considerations. So you can be building strong relationships with kids while also building their intellective capacity. So there are two ways to think about your digital presentations. When you're making decisions about what you're presenting, you can present any number of writing lessons, reading lessons. Those can be literacy strategies or literary analysis lessons. You can provide grammar lessons, and you can draw from any aspect of what I like to call a temp lesson arc. And I just think of temp as the way to really heat up a lesson. Specifically, you can offer a teaching opportunity. That would be a recorded lecture or some explicit instruction on the content of your class. You can also present a digital example, which is maybe a recorded explanation of a finished product's qualities and features. You can present modeling opportunities. This would be a recorded explanation that makes the invisible thinking processes needed to complete this work visible to the learner. And then finally, you can present practice, which is any recorded explanation that involves the students in practicing the concept or skill that you're working on in class. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, I'm not exactly sure how to find this digital content, then I would just welcome you to go to YouTube, and you can search a host of different topics there. Now, I have created my own library of content with my spouse. We call it Warner Jordan Education. That might be a good place to start if you have nowhere else to go. We have organized our stuff into playlists, and you can see we have some AP US history readings. We have some specific content around books. We have things like grammar study, poetry, vocabulary development. We have content on writing and reading strategies, government, literary analysis, you name it, it's there. And if you have the time and the interest in creating your own lessons, there are tons of websites like Screencastify that will help you to do this work. But if you are not down with recording your own instruction or your own content, there are ways that you can get around that, because YouTube is just replete with opportunities for you to assign lessons there. So once you have assigned digital content to students, you can actually create collaborative opportunities during that recorded instruction time for your students. So you would start by having your students seated in collaborative groups. I recommend 3 to 4. And you can start with something like collaborative note-taking. So what you see here is a note sheet that I've created for students, and you can create inside of this stop and think moments. What you would do is just right here, you might create a square and just say stop and think, record your musings, or something of that nature. You can create collaborative summaries where the summary has to contain the same information from all of the students in that group. Or you can create an entire collaborative document where students have to consider, synthesize, think critically and discuss with their colleagues what they're going to write down, and they have to all create or decide on writing down the same things. So that builds in those collaborative opportunities during their recorded instruction to think while they talk. And so it just develops their collaboration skills and it develops their critical thinking skills. Another thing you can do is have kids create a visual representation. So they create visuals that capture their understanding of whatever the digital recorded content is, and then they have to teach their visuals to their group mates. So it might be something like this. If you were teaching a lesson on the 5 components of literacy instruction, you might ask them to create a visual representation of that. So somebody could create an octopus whose tentacles are phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, and fluency, and the head is comprehension. Another thing you can do to support growth and collaboration is to create table tents and have them sitting on the table. You can start those at sort of a basic collaborative level, like it would include general ideas about how to collaborate effectively or reflective questions to ask yourself during your collaboration. And throughout the course of the year, those could get more sophisticated. So for example, it could turn into ask these kinds of questions to each other, ask these kinds of questions of the author, ask these kinds of questions to yourself. And while those collaborative opportunities are happening for the students who are engaging with the digital content, this is your opportunity to conference with students in order to build, develop, deepen, or repair your relationships. So here are some ideas for the beginning of the year when you're just developing relationships with students. You can have follow-up conversations based on what you're learning about the students in their reading and writing questionnaires. You can follow up based on any baseline assessments that you've given, or set goals for conversations that you're going to have throughout the year based on what they want to accomplish in your class. It's also a great time to do an initial check-in for any students who have indicated that their names and pronouns in school differ from the ones they use at home, so that you can be sure that when you're contacting parents or during parent-teacher conferences that you're referring to the student by their chosen names and pronouns. And then finally, it's a great time to check in with your emerging bilinguals to ascertain kind of which affective filter issues that you are going to want to deal with. Like, to what extent are you going to want to slow down your speech? To what extent are you going to want to give vocabulary supports on a word wall and things like that? Now, throughout the course of the year, you're going to want to conference with students in ways that deepen your relationships with them. So this would be opportunities for teach or reteach sessions based on content goals or on summative assessments that you've seen where you know that kids are struggling. It could be an individual check-in based on a student's social or emotional goals, or based on any of your teaching anecdotal records. If you see a student who's struggling in some way, these individual conferences are a great way for you to ask a student how they're doing without having to put them on blast. And then, as we all know, sometimes our relationships with kids aren't going as well as we wish they were. And so there are also opportunities here for you to have a conference to repair a relationship. And these would be based on just a demonstrated need that a kid's showing that they need to connect differently or better with you, that you need to connect differently or better with them. And so it's just that one-on-one opportunity to see a student on their most human level and to check in and reach out to that kid. So ultimately, there are 2 takeaways here. This work that we're doing is critical. We want to concurrently build their ability to think deeply over a sustained period of time through their struggle in order for them to figure out how it looks to be a critical and lifelong independent thinker. And then the content that we've discussed today really creates that playing field for us to work in partnership with students, to create an allyship with them, to guide them in their own independence, while also concurrently creating that content that we need in order for them to deepen their skills as learners, readers, writers, and thinkers. Thank you.